The streets of New York have always whispered secrets, stories of power, fear, and ambition. Among these stories, none resonated as loudly, as dangerously, as that of Lucky Luciano. Born Salvatore Lucania, he emerged from the chaos of the Lower East Side to become the architect of the modern American Mafia. But Luciano was not merely a criminal. He was a visionary in a world built on violence, hierarchy, and survival. His life was a tapestry woven from ambition, ruthlessness, cunning, and an uncanny ability to manipulate both allies and adversaries alike. From the very beginning, his path was marked by contrasts: poverty and opulence, loyalty and betrayal, fear and respect. Understanding Luciano is to understand the very nature of power in the underworld, where every choice could mean life or death. In the early decades of the 20th century, New York was a city of immigrants, overcrowded tenements, and endless opportunity shadowed by crime. Italian neighborhoods were crowded with families scraping together a living, their streets teeming with small-time thieves, gangsters, and hustlers trying to carve out a place in a society that often overlooked them. It was within this combustible mix of poverty and ambition that Luciano's story began. He was not born into wealth or influence. His family struggled, like countless others, to survive the harsh realities of urban life. Yet even as a boy, Luciano displayed a restless energy and an instinct for strategy that set him apart. While others were content to navigate the daily grind, he saw patterns in chaos, opportunities in danger, and a path to power where none seemed possible. The story of Luciano's rise cannot be told without acknowledging the psychological forces at play in his early life. Growing up in a neighborhood defined by survival, he learned quickly that strength and intelligence were inseparable from reputation. Respect had to be earned, often through intimidation or cunning, and the weak were trampled. In the shadows of the tenements, young Salvatore honed his instincts: how to read people, how to exploit situations, and how to turn potential threats into stepping stones. These formative experiences would later define the way he navigated the treacherous waters of organized crime, where every alliance was tentative and every loyalty measured against the cost of disloyalty. By the time he was a teenager, Luciano had already begun to assert himself on the streets. Small acts of theft and mischief escalated into serious criminal endeavors. He moved through the ranks of street gangs with a combination of charisma, intelligence, and ruthlessness, traits that would become his signature. Unlike many of his peers who relied solely on brute force, Luciano understood the subtle power of perception. To control people, it was not enough to intimidate them. He needed them to believe in his inevitability, in the idea that resistance was futile. This psychological mastery allowed him to rise faster than anyone else in the chaotic underworld, positioning himself not merely as a participant, but as a strategist, an architect of influence. The period that would define the golden age of the Mafia was one of both opportunity and danger. Prohibition loomed on the horizon, promising unprecedented wealth for those daring enough to exploit it. The streets, once chaotic and fragmented, were about to become the stage for Luciano's most ambitious designs. In this world, old-school mobsters clung to outdated methods and personal grudges, while Luciano envisioned a system, an organized, structured empire where crime was not just survival but business. His approach was revolutionary. He would not only consolidate power but also impose rules, standards, and hierarchies that transformed criminal operations into sophisticated enterprises. Yet even at the height of his later power, Luciano's story always carried the tension of the streets from which he came. Every decision, every alliance, and every betrayal was shadowed by the lessons of his youth. The lessons of poverty, of struggle, of knowing that life in the underworld was as fragile as it was rewarding. His legend would grow, not only because of his successes but also because of the fear and respect he commanded. He was a man who could charm and manipulate with equal skill, who could orchestrate violence with precision, and who understood that power was both a tool and a weapon. As the story unfolds, viewers will witness not just the events of Luciano's life, but the emotional and psychological landscape that shaped him. The streets of New York spoke his name because he embodied the contradictions of ambition: brutality tempered with intelligence, ruthlessness tempered with strategy, and fear tempered with vision. Understanding Lucky Luciano is understanding the anatomy of power in a world that balanced on the knife edge between chaos and control. From these streets emerged a man who would forever change the face of organized crime, whose influence would reach far beyond the alleys and backrooms of New York, into the very structures of law, society, and legend. The Lower East Side of Manhattan at the turn of the 20th century was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of narrow streets, crowded tenements, and the constant pulse of survival. Immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe pressed into the city's neighborhoods, bringing with them traditions, dreams, and the heavy weight of expectation. For the Lucania family, freshly arrived from Sicily, life was a daily negotiation with hardship. Small apartments crowded with relatives, the smell of coal smoke mingling with the streets, the constant struggle to scrape together enough for food and rent. This was the crucible in which Salvatore Luciano would be forged. From the very beginning, young Salvatore displayed a restless intelligence. He watched, memorized, and adapted to the rhythms of the city. In the chaos of the tenements, he learned lessons that no classroom could teach: how to read faces for deception, how to navigate disputes without escalating violence, and how subtle manipulation could achieve what brute force never could. He understood the unspoken hierarchy of the streets, where survival depended not just on strength, but on wit, timing, and the ability to command respect even in the most unforgiving environments. Poverty was a constant companion. The Lucania family, like so many others, faced the grinding reality of working-class life: long hours in factories, cramped living spaces, and little hope of upward mobility through legitimate means. But in these harsh conditions, Salvatore's mind began to conceive a different kind of opportunity. While other boys played in the streets or followed in their father's trades, he began to understand the allure of power, the seductive promise that control over one's environment could elevate a man above his circumstances. It was not ambition alone that drove him, but a keen observation of human behavior, the realization that fear, loyalty, and cunning were currencies as valuable as money. Education was inconsistent at best. Schools in the Lower East Side were overcrowded, underfunded, and frequently chaotic, a reflection of the social upheaval around them. But Luciano was not a boy to be confined by formal learning. He learned from experience, from the street vendors, the local gang leaders, and even the petty thieves who prowled the alleys. Every encounter, every slight, every lesson in negotiation or intimidation became a part of his personal curriculum. He absorbed patterns of power and survival that would later inform his revolutionary approach to organized crime. The neighborhood itself was a crucible of violence and competition. Gangs fought over territory, rival families sought influence, and the law often appeared as a distant, ineffectual force, more obstacle than protector. For young Salvatore, the streets were both playground and battlefield. Early scuffles and minor thefts were not mere mischief, they were training grounds. Each fight, each confrontation sharpened his instincts. He learned when to strike, when to retreat, and most importantly, when to negotiate. By his teenage years, he was already navigating these social networks with a precision and calm that far exceeded his age. Family dynamics also played a critical role in shaping his psyche. In the Lucania household, discipline was strict but inconsistent, love interwoven with expectation. Children were expected to contribute, to survive, and to respect the unwritten rules of Sicilian tradition. Loyalty to family, respect for elders, and understanding one's place within a hierarchy were values that Luciano absorbed deeply. Yet, paradoxically, the very rigidity of these expectations also fueled a streak of independence. He learned early that to rise, one sometimes had to bend or reinterpret the rules, to forge alliances beyond the immediate circle of family and neighborhood. By his late teens, Luciano's ambitions were already taking shape. The streets of the Lower East Side had given him a unique education in human psychology and strategy. He understood the mechanics of influence, the subtle power of fear and respect, and the ways in which loyalty could be bought, earned, or manipulated. This knowledge, combined with his natural intelligence and charm, allowed him to navigate the treacherous social networks of immigrant gangs with remarkable skill. He was no longer merely a participant in the chaos around him. He was beginning to shape it, to assert control over it, to see opportunities where others only saw danger. Even as he engaged in petty crime, there was a vision emerging within Luciano's mind. A vision of organization, of hierarchy, of power consolidated in a way that the disorganized gangs of his youth could never achieve. He began to see that the chaos of the streets was not a permanent state, but a system waiting to be mastered. The very environment that had been brutal and unforgiving also provided the tools he would need: networks of influence, an understanding of human desire and fear, and a first-hand lesson in the consequences of failure. This early life in the Lower East Side was a paradoxical gift. The deprivation and violence of his environment were tempered by opportunity, by lessons in strategy, and by exposure to the raw forces of human ambition. Salvatore Luciano was learning the rules of a different kind of society, one governed not by law or morality, but by power, cunning, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. By understanding the streets, the loyalties, and the fears of those around him, He was laying the foundation for a career that would redefine the underworld, transforming organized crime from fragmented chaos into a disciplined empire. The Lower East Side did more than shape a criminal, it shaped a legend. It taught Luciano that survival was inseparable from strategy, that fear could be wielded as a tool, and that intelligence was often more powerful than brute force. It was here, among the crowded tenements and chaotic streets, that the boy who would become Lucky Luciano learned to see the world as a chessboard, and himself as the player who would move pieces with precision, patience, and ruthless calculation. From these streets, he would rise to command not just respect, but fear, not just loyalty, but influence that stretched far beyond the boroughs of New York. By the time Salvatore Luciano entered his teenage years, the streets of the Lower East Side were no longer just his home, they had become his proving ground. The chaotic neighborhoods, teeming with gangs, petty criminals, and opportunists, offered a harsh education that no classroom could provide. Every corner, every alley, every stoop held a lesson in power and survival. For Luciano, these streets were both a challenge and an opportunity, a place where ambition could be measured against reality, and where even a boy could begin to make a name for himself. Luciano's first forays into crime were small, almost imperceptible acts at first, lifting coins from a distracted vendor, sneaking into a shop, or running errands for older boys who ran the local gangs. But these early acts were not simply youthful mischief. They were experiments in risk, in manipulation, in understanding human behavior. Each success built confidence, each failure taught caution. Luciano began to realize that crime was not only a means of survival, it was a way to assert identity, to command respect, and to carve a place in a world that often ignored those at the bottom. It was during these formative years that Luciano discovered his natural talent for leadership and strategy. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied solely on brute force or intimidation, he understood the subtle power of influence. He could read a person in seconds, identify weaknesses, and exploit them without unnecessary confrontation. This psychological acuity would become his most powerful weapon. Small gangs, initially wary of his youth, soon recognized his capacity to organize, negotiate, and lead. Luciano's early acts of crime were, in essence, exercises in testing these variabilities, learning how to command loyalty, instill fear, and maintain control. The gangs themselves were fragmented and chaotic, a reflection of the immigrant communities they came from. Fights over territory, stolen goods, or personal grudges erupted frequently. Many boys became victims of the violence they witnessed daily, but Luciano learned to navigate the hazards with a calculated calm. He understood that in the criminal underworld, reputation was everything. To be feared, respected, and eventually followed, one had to balance audacity with restraint, aggression with intelligence. Luciano's early reputation was built not on sheer violence, but on his uncanny ability to anticipate the moves of others, turning potential threats into opportunities. It was also a time when mentorship, whether chosen or imposed by circumstance, shaped the trajectory of young criminals. Luciano fell under the watchful eyes of older gang members, men who recognized in him a rare blend of intelligence, courage, and ambition. These figures introduced him to the unwritten rules of the streets, the importance of loyalty, the cost of betrayal, and the delicate balance between trust and suspicion. Luciano absorbed these lessons voraciously, not as passive obedience, but as raw material for his own evolving philosophy of power. Each encounter, each observation became a building block for the man he was destined to become. By his mid-teens, Luciano's criminal activities began to escalate. Petty theft gave way to organized burglaries, protection rackets, and early attempts at extortion. Unlike many of his peers, he did not engage in violence recklessly. Instead, he used it strategically, understanding that fear could be as potent a tool as fists or knives. He was learning to think several steps ahead, to see the web of relationships, loyalties, and rivalries that govern the underworld, and to position himself at the center of that web. These early operations, though modest in scope, demonstrated a level of foresight and cunning that would later define his empire. The environment in which Luciano operated was unforgiving. Law enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt, immigrant communities were insular, and gang wars were constant. One misstep could mean imprisonment, or worse. Luciano's genius was in recognizing that survival required more than boldness. It required observation, patience, and adaptability. He learned to read patterns, to anticipate the moves of both allies and rivals, and to exploit weaknesses with precision. The boy who once navigated tenement stairwells now began to see the city itself as a board game, with territories, players, and stakes that demanded both strategic calculation and psychological insight. During this period, the psychological foundations of his later empire began to take shape. Luciano understood that fear could be weaponized, that respect could be negotiated, and that loyalty was often conditional, but manipulable. He observed how older criminals wielded influence and how petty mistakes could unravel entire operations. This awareness was paired with an emerging ambition, a desire not just to survive or dominate a small gang, but to rise above the fragmented chaos of the Lower East Side entirely. Luciano was beginning to see the possibility of consolidating power, of creating order from disorder, and of transforming street crime into something more, something resembling business. Even in these early years, Luciano's dual nature was evident. On one hand, he could be ruthless, cold, and calculating. On the other, he possessed a charm and intelligence that drew people to him, a charisma that made others willingly follow his lead. This combination of fear and fascination would become the hallmark of his leadership style. While others relied solely on muscle, Luciano relied on strategy, psychology, and the careful cultivation of influence. His early criminal steps were not merely acts of survival, they were the initial movements in a carefully choreographed ascent to power. By the end of his teenage years, Salvatore Luciano had already begun to distinguish himself from the countless other boys scrambling for survival in the Lower East Side. He was no longer just another street kid, he was a strategist, a student of human behavior, and a budding architect of a criminal empire. Each act of theft, each skirmish, each negotiated alliance added to his understanding of the streets and, more importantly, of the human psyche. These experiences would serve as the foundation for his later innovations in organized crime, shaping a figure who could command fear, loyalty, and respect in equal measure. The first steps in crime were, for Luciano, a crucible of learning, experimentation, and psychological mastery. They forged the instincts, ambitions, and strategies that would later allow him to rise above the fragmented chaos of the New York underworld. In these formative years, the streets spoke to him and he listened, not just to survive but to conquer, to envision a future where the disorder of the city could be transformed into a system he controlled. These early lessons would echo throughout his life, laying the groundwork for the legendary figure who would come to be known as Lucky Luciano. As Salvatore Luciano transitioned from a streetwise teenager into a young man, the chaotic world of the Lower East Side became his training ground for something far greater than petty crime. The lessons of his youth, the constant negotiation of fear, loyalty, and survival, had honed instincts that few could rival. By the time he stepped into the broader underworld, he was no longer just another gang member scrambling for scraps of power. He was a strategist, a mind capable of seeing patterns in chaos, and a man with a vision for dominance that extended far beyond street corners. Climbing the ranks of the criminal underworld required more than courage. It demanded intellect, patience, and a cold understanding of human nature, all of which Luciano possessed in abundance. His entry into organized crime proper was facilitated by alliances with older, more established mobsters who recognized his potential. These men, entrenched in the Sicilian and Neapolitan criminal networks that had long operated in New York, saw in Luciano a rare combination of audacity and strategic thought. Unlike many who relied purely on brute force or intimidation, Luciano approached the underworld like a chessboard. Every action, every alliance, every betrayal was calculated, measured, and designed to expand his influence. While others competed over territory and reputation in fits of short-sighted rage, Luciano observed, learned, and waited for the precise moment to strike. The early 1920s in New York were a transformative time for organized crime. Prohibition had just begun, and the ban on alcohol created a flood of opportunities for those willing to take risks. Gang wars erupted over control of bootlegging, speakeasies, and smuggling routes, creating an environment where ambition could flourish, but only for the cunning. Luciano was quick to see that traditional hierarchies were inefficient, and that the old guard, while respected, were vulnerable to modern methods of organization. He moved deliberately, embedding himself within key operations, learning the ins and outs of bootlegging, gambling, and extortion, all while cultivating a reputation for shrewdness and reliability. Mentorship played a crucial role in his ascent. Figures like Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler and fixer, exposed Luciano to the sophistication of high-stakes crime. Through these relationships, he learned that power could be wielded not only with violence but with negotiation, manipulation, and strategic partnerships. Luciano internalized these lessons, combining the street-hardened instincts of his youth with the business-minded approach of seasoned operators. It was this fusion of street smarts and strategic intelligence that set him apart, allowing him to rise faster than rivals who relied solely on force or intimidation. One of the most defining aspects of Luciano's climb was his ability to form alliances across ethnic and regional lines. At a time when the Italian underworld was fragmented, divided between Sicilian traditionalists and ambitious newcomers, Luciano recognized the power of collaboration. He cultivated relationships with Jewish and Irish gangsters, bridging cultural divides that had previously prevented the formation of unified criminal enterprises. These alliances were not born of idealism. They were strategic tools designed to consolidate power, control resources, and minimize conflict. Luciano understood that true dominance required diplomacy as much as brutality, and that long-term success demanded careful management of both allies and enemies. Rivalries inevitably emerged, as they always do in a world governed by ambition and fear. Some older bosses resented the young upstart, viewing his methods as dangerous or unorthodox. Violent confrontations, betrayals, and calculated intimidation became part of the process of asserting dominance. Luciano, however, was not reckless. He avoided unnecessary exposure, striking only when the risk outweighed the reward and when he had ensured that allies were positioned to support him. Each victory solidified his reputation, each strategic maneuver expanded his influence, and each display of cunning demonstrated that his ascent was not a fluke but the result of methodical planning and psychological mastery. By the mid-1920s, Luciano's position in the New York underworld was no longer peripheral. He had become a key figure in the reshaping of organized crime, demonstrating a remarkable ability to merge traditional Sicilian codes of loyalty with modern principles of efficiency and organization. His approach was revolutionary. Rather than relying solely on fear and personal loyalty, he implemented structures that mirrored legitimate business operations. Hierarchies, divisions of labor, and systems of accountability transformed criminal enterprises from chaotic networks into disciplined operations capable of generating enormous profit. Luciano's genius lay not just in the accumulation of power, but in the creation of a sustainable system that could survive beyond the strength of any one individual. Psychologically, this period of ascension revealed the duality that would define Luciano's leadership. He was ruthless when required, unflinching in the application of violence, yet remarkably calculating and restrained when foresight demanded patience. He inspired both fear and admiration, often simultaneously. Those who followed him did so not merely out of obligation but because they recognized his vision and the rewards of loyalty. Those who opposed him learned quickly that defiance carried costs that were both swift and severe. In navigating this balance, Luciano perfected the art of control, the ability to influence, manipulate, and command without exposing himself to unnecessary vulnerability. The streets, the alleys, the hidden corners of New York became a theater in which Luciano performed with precision. Each move was a calculated message to rivals and allies alike. Strength tempered with intelligence, ambition tempered with strategy, and ruthlessness tempered with vision. By the time he had consolidated his position, he was no longer just a rising gangster. He was a strategist, a negotiator, and a visionary capable of seeing the criminal landscape in ways few others could. His climb through the ranks was not merely about survival or short-term gain, it was about crafting a legacy, about reshaping the very architecture of organized crime in New York. This ascent also marked a turning point in his personal philosophy. Luciano began to see that loyalty could be measured and manipulated, that fear could be calibrated, and that alliances were tools as much as weapons. He was no longer reacting to the chaos of the streets, he was orchestrating it. In doing so, he set the stage for the next phase of his career, the creation of a modern mafia, structured, efficient, and ruthlessly disciplined, capable of dominating the underworld not through brute force alone but through vision, strategy, and psychological mastery. By the late 1920s, Salvatore Luciano had transformed from a streetwise youth into a commanding figure in New York's criminal hierarchy. He had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of ambition, to leverage intelligence over violence, and to see opportunity where others saw only danger. The foundation for his empire had been laid, built on the lessons of survival, strategy, and human psychology that had shaped him from the tenements of the Lower East Side. Climbing the ranks was only the beginning. The world of organized crime would never be the same, and Luciano's name would soon echo far beyond the streets that had forged him. By the late 1920s, Salvatore "Lucky" Luciano had transcended the role of a mere street gangster. He was no longer content to navigate the fragmented chaos of the Lower East Side or play second fiddle to the aging Sicilian bosses. His vision was far greater. He sought to construct a new kind of criminal enterprise, one that combined discipline, strategy, and psychology into a system capable of dominating the underworld with precision. Where older mobsters clung to tradition, personal grudges, and impulsive displays of violence, Luciano saw an opportunity to modernize organized crime, transforming it from a patchwork of chaotic factions into a sophisticated, hierarchically structured empire. The foundation of this new mafia rested on two principles: efficiency and centralization. Luciano understood that fragmented operations invited conflict, redundancy, and vulnerability. He observed that rival gangs often fought among themselves over territories and profits, weakening the collective power of the Italian-American criminal community. To counter this, he envisioned a structure that mirrored legitimate businesses, defined leadership, delegated authority, and a clear chain of command. Each territory, each operation, whether gambling, bootlegging, or extortion, was assigned to trusted lieutenants, accountable not just to him personally but to the system he was building. Central to this reorganization was the creation of the Mafia Commission. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to persuade powerful but often stubborn gang leaders that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. The commission was not a monarchy or a dictatorship. It was a council, a governing body designed to arbitrate disputes, coordinate operations, and allocate resources fairly among families. By giving even rival bosses a voice, Luciano reduced the chaos of internecine warfare and created a system in which collective gain outweighed personal vendetta. This was revolutionary. For the first time, organized crime in America operated not merely as a collection of violent factions, but as an integrated network with rules, accountability, and strategy. Psychologically, Luciano understood that power was as much about perception as it was about control. His personal charisma, intelligence, and ability to negotiate made him a figure both respected and feared. But he also realized that influence could be extended beyond personal relationships through institutional design. By codifying rules, creating structures, and enforcing a code of loyalty, he shifted the balance of power from individual temperaments to systemic control. Fear, respect, and loyalty were no longer fleeting, they became embedded in the very architecture of the organization he was building. Luciano's approach to alliances further demonstrated his strategic brilliance. Unlike the older generation of mobsters who often acted solely within ethnic or regional lines, he embraced collaboration across communities. Jewish, Irish, and other criminal factions became partners rather than enemies. Luciano recognized that organized crime was no longer a small-town enterprise, it was a business, and business thrived on strategic partnerships. By bridging cultural divides, he expanded his operational network, increased profitability, and minimized unnecessary violence, all while consolidating power under his vision of order. This period also highlighted Luciano's psychological insight into human behavior. He understood the delicate balance between loyalty and fear. Lieutenants and associates knew that obedience brought rewards, but betrayal, or even inefficiency, carried consequences. He reinforced these lessons not just through personal authority but through institutional enforcement. Rewards were distributed strategically, ensuring that loyalty was not only maintained but incentivized. Conversely, swift and calculated retribution for betrayal demonstrated that the system he built was not abstract. It was real, and it would be enforced without hesitation. Luciano's restructuring extended to the very mechanics of criminal operations. Prohibition had created unprecedented opportunities in bootlegging, gambling, and illicit trade, but it had also intensified competition. Luciano's organizational model allowed operations to scale efficiently. He implemented a division of labor. Frontline enforcers, intermediaries, and managers each had clearly defined roles. Operations were monitored and coordinated to maximize profit and minimize risk. In essence, Luciano transformed what had previously been informal networks of thieves and racketeers into a business empire that could operate on a city-wide, and eventually nationwide, scale. Yet, the genius of Luciano's system was not purely mechanical. It was profoundly psychological. He recognized that for an organization to endure, it needed more than rules and hierarchies. It required culture. Loyalty, obedience, and honor were internalized through shared rituals, codes of conduct, and the ever-present specter of consequence. The Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence, was a cornerstone. It instilled fear and discipline, binding members together while ensuring that external threats, from law enforcement to rival factions, faced a united front. Luciano's genius was in embedding psychology into structure. Control was achieved not only by force but by the very way the organization made its members think, act, and perceive their world. The broader impact of Luciano's reforms cannot be overstated. By the early 1930s, the Mafia was no longer a loose collection of violent gangs. It had become a coordinated, efficient, and highly profitable network. Luciano's vision allowed for expansion into multiple cities, diversification into new ventures, and a capacity for resilience that older, chaotic models lacked. Where previous generations had relied on fear and intimidation alone, Luciano built a system in which intelligence, strategy, and psychological insight amplified raw power. His approach was holistic. Violence was a tool, not a defining characteristic. Loyalty was a resource, not a guarantee, and influence was both direct and institutionalized. The consolidation of power also demonstrated Luciano's ability to anticipate challenges before they arose. He understood that law enforcement would eventually respond with force, that rival factions would resist, and that internal dissent could threaten stability. By structuring his organization with redundancy, checks, and distributed authority, he created a system capable of absorbing shocks, managing conflict, and maintaining continuity. In doing so, Luciano was not simply creating an empire, he was creating a model for survival, longevity, and dominance that would endure long after his own reign. It was during this period that the myth of Lucky Luciano truly began to crystallize. He was not merely a man of the streets. He was a visionary, a strategist, and a psychologist who understood the levers of human behavior as well as he understood violence and opportunity. To the outside world, he was a criminal genius. To those within the organization, he was both a leader and a symbol of what the new mafia could be. His methods combined ruthlessness with intellect, intimidation with negotiation, and vision with execution. He had transformed the chaotic underworld into a sophisticated empire, one capable of operating with precision and efficiency across an entire nation. Luciano's role as the architect of the new mafia marked a turning point in the history of organized crime. The city that had once been a fragmented patchwork of rival gangs now had a unified, strategic system that could dominate markets, neutralize conflict, and expand influence. Through structure, psychology, and foresight, Luciano had created an empire where chaos had once ruled. And while the streets continued to speak his name with awe and fear, the true genius of his rise lay not in violence alone, but in vision. The vision of a mafia built not merely on terror, but on intelligence, discipline, and enduring power. In the world of Lucky Luciano, power was not simply about muscle, money, or intimidation. It was about trust, control, and a system of rules that governed behavior as rigorously as any law in the outside world. Central to this was the ancient Sicilian principle of omerta, the code of silence that dictated loyalty, secrecy, and honor above all else. For Luciano, omerta was more than tradition. It was the psychological glue that bound his empire together, the invisible thread that ensured that fear, loyalty, and respect were maintained without constant enforcement. In a universe governed by violence, betrayal, and ambition, the code was both sword and shield. Omerta demanded total loyalty to the family, absolute silence in the face of law enforcement, and an unyielding commitment to honor, even when personal interest or survival seemed to suggest otherwise. Luciano understood the code's psychological power. It was not just about preventing members from talking. It was about creating a culture in which loyalty became instinctive, fear became a motivator, and betrayal carried consequences both immediate and enduring. The code functioned as a social contract, binding individuals not through legal threats, but through deeply internalized values reinforced by fear and respect. The psychological dimension of omerta cannot be overstated. For the mafia to function as an organized system, loyalty could not be coerced permanently, it had to be cultivated. Luciano mastered the delicate balance of reward and punishment. Those who displayed competence and obedience were rewarded with wealth, influence, and protection. Those who faltered, disobeyed, or betrayed the organization faced swift and often brutal retribution. In this environment, loyalty was not optional, it was a survival strategy, a currency that ensured long-term security and opportunity. Members learned quickly that adherence to the code was as vital as any operational skill. But omerta was more than a rulebook. It was a psychological framework that shaped decision-making at every level of the organization. It dictated behavior, controlled ambition, and created an ecosystem in which fear and respect coexisted. A gangster operating outside the code risked not just personal punishment but the destabilization of the entire network. By institutionalizing this principle, Luciano was able to create cohesion in an empire built from inherently violent and ambitious individuals. Where previously alliances had been fragile, loyalty unreliable, and betrayal common, the code created predictability, structure, and a culture of disciplined obedience. The code also served as a tool of strategic manipulation. Luciano understood that loyalty could be earned and fear could be calibrated. Omerta provided the framework for this manipulation, giving him leverage over associates without requiring constant intervention. The knowledge that betrayal would bring consequences, combined with the promise of protection and reward for obedience, ensured that his directives were followed with minimal supervision. In essence, Luciano outsourced his control to the culture itself. The code became the mechanism through which his vision of a unified, disciplined mafia could operate at scale, even as he extended his influence across cities and states. Within this system, betrayal became the ultimate crime. It was not merely a violation of personal trust, it was a threat to the stability of the entire organization. Luciano demonstrated repeatedly that disloyalty would be met with calculated retribution, often executed in ways designed to maximize psychological impact. Rumors, sudden disappearances, and orchestrated acts of violence served as constant reminders of the consequences of crossing the organization. This created an environment in which loyalty was reinforced not only through direct rewards but through the constant, underlying presence of fear, a fear that was as structured and predictable as the rules themselves. Omerta also influenced Luciano's relationships with rival gangs and law enforcement. By cultivating a culture of secrecy, he ensured that internal knowledge remained compartmentalized. Members were trained to operate independently, yet in alignment with the organization's goals. Strategic operations, from bootlegging to gambling, were insulated from exposure, reducing risk and maximizing efficiency. Law enforcement encountered a disciplined, silent adversary, one that could absorb pressure and adapt without revealing the inner workings of its network. In this way, the code became both a shield against external threats and a tool for internal cohesion. Yet, the code was not inflexible. Luciano recognized that rules must serve strategy. While Omerta demanded loyalty and silence, it also allowed for calculated flexibility when necessary. Betrayal could be tolerated if it ultimately served the organization's broader goals, and silence could be negotiated when it ensured survival or advantage. This pragmatic application of the code distinguished Luciano from many traditionalists who adhered rigidly to ritual without understanding its utility. He transformed Omerta from a cultural tradition into a functional tool of power, a principle that guided decisions, enforced discipline, and amplified his authority across the underworld. The psychological power of Omerta was particularly evident in the way it shaped ambition within the organization. Members understood that rising through the ranks required not only competence but absolute adherence to the code. Loyalty, obedience, and discretion were the currencies of advancement. The code created a meritocratic element within a violent and hierarchical system. Those who internalized it, demonstrated strategic thinking, and executed orders effectively were rewarded, while those who failed or betrayed the organization were removed. In this way, Omerta ensured not only survival but the cultivation of talent and discipline. The broader significance of the code extended beyond individual behavior. Omerta became the cultural DNA of the modern mafia. It standardized behavior across families, cities, and even states, providing a common framework for cooperation, negotiation, and conflict resolution. By embedding loyalty and fear into the very psyche of his organization, Luciano created an empire that could operate with consistency, resilience, and foresight. It was a system in which trust was cultivated through culture, fear was institutionalized, and power could be extended far beyond the immediate reach of any single individual. Through the lens of Omerta, the genius of Luciano's leadership becomes clear. He did not rely solely on charisma, violence, or intimidation. He built a psychological ecosystem, one in which loyalty was self-enforcing, fear was predictable, and obedience was rational. The code transformed the chaotic underworld into a disciplined, functioning society of its own, one in which members understood the rules, the stakes, and the rewards. It was a system that allowed him to consolidate power, manage ambition, and enforce control over a sprawling, dangerous, and often volatile network. In the end, the code that ruled all was more than a set of rules, it was the backbone of Luciano's empire. Omerta created cohesion, enforced loyalty, and amplified the reach of his authority. It shaped behavior, controlled ambition, and instilled discipline. It was both the sword and the shield of his organization, the invisible mechanism through which he exercised control over a world built on violence, ambition, and betrayal. Understanding the code is understanding Luciano himself, a man who combined ruthlessness with intelligence, fear with strategy, and tradition with innovation, laying the foundations for the modern mafia. By the time Lucky Luciano had firmly established himself within the underworld hierarchy, his vision extended far beyond territory disputes and street-level power. He sought not only to dominate but to systematize the business of crime, transforming what had once been fragmented, violent, and chaotic operations into a sophisticated empire of vice. Gambling dens, illegal breweries, prostitution rings, and labor rackets became the foundation of his empire, each operation carefully structured, managed, and optimized for maximum profit. Luciano's genius lay not in inventing crime. Illegal enterprises had existed for decades, but in transforming these enterprises into organized, efficient systems, capable of producing extraordinary wealth while minimizing internal chaos. Prohibition provided the perfect catalyst. The ban on alcohol in the United States created an enormous, unregulated market, and Luciano understood that control over supply, distribution, and enforcement could yield vast profits. He leveraged both intimidation and negotiation to dominate bootlegging networks, forging alliances with Irish, Jewish, and other ethnic criminal groups to ensure smooth operation and mutual protection. Speakeasies flourished under his watch, with liquor flowing into every corner of New York, and the profits funneled into his growing empire. But Luciano's approach was far from reckless. Every shipment, every deal, and every territory was meticulously managed, creating a sense of order where once there had been anarchy. Gambling was another cornerstone of his empire. Casinos, underground poker rooms, and betting parlors became structured enterprises, overseen by trusted lieutenants who reported directly to him. Luciano's organizational strategy transformed gambling from an informal activity into a business operation, complete with bookkeepers, enforcers, and a chain of command to manage disputes and enforce rules. This systematic approach not only increased profitability but also solidified his reputation as a leader who could combine ruthlessness with efficiency. Those who operated within his system quickly understood that loyalty and competence were rewarded, while dishonesty or incompetence carried severe consequences. Prostitution, long considered a dangerous and chaotic enterprise, was also brought under Luciano's meticulous control. Rather than allowing independent operators to run loose and invite law enforcement scrutiny, he centralized operations, implemented strict rules, and demanded loyalty from those involved. Brothels and escort services were run like businesses, with revenue streams carefully monitored and risk strategically managed. By creating oversight and accountability, Luciano minimized the kind of disorder that often led to exposure or rival conflicts, turning a historically unstable and dangerous enterprise into a reliable source of revenue. Labor rackets presented another dimension of his criminal empire. Unions and dock operations became tools for both profit and power. Luciano understood that control over labor meant influence over key economic sectors, and he used intimidation, bribery, and negotiation to secure compliance. Strikes, sabotage, and manipulation of shipping contracts became mechanisms for extracting wealth and consolidating influence. By intertwining legitimate labor structures with his criminal operations, Luciano blurred the lines between legality and illegality, creating a web of influence that extended far beyond the underworld. His ability to infiltrate and control these sectors demonstrated not only tactical intelligence but also a deep understanding of societal systems and human behavior. Psychologically, Luciano's management of vice operations revealed his understanding of both risk and reward. He knew that unchecked ambition within his ranks could lead to instability, and he used the twin levers of fear and incentive to maintain control. Competent and loyal lieutenants were rewarded with both wealth and authority, reinforcing their commitment to the organization. Those who acted recklessly or betrayed the empire faced consequences designed to be instructive as much as punitive, sending a clear message throughout the network. In this way, Luciano cultivated an environment in which obedience was rational and ambition could be directed into productive, profitable channels. Perhaps most revolutionary was Luciano's ability to standardize operations across the city, and eventually the nation. Unlike previous mobsters who operated independently and often clashed with rivals, he created systems of collaboration and coordination. Different criminal families were assigned territories, responsibilities, and operational protocols, reducing conflicts and maximizing profit. Information was carefully controlled, and decisions were centralized within the commission, ensuring that disputes were resolved efficiently and that the broader network remained stable. This level of organization was unprecedented in American organized crime and became a defining characteristic of Luciano's empire. The human element was equally important. Luciano understood that people were both his greatest asset and his greatest liability. He selected lieutenants who combined competence with loyalty, creating layers of accountability that reinforced discipline throughout the organization. Training, mentorship, and careful observation ensured that subordinates internalized both the practical skills and the psychological mindset necessary for survival and success. The empire was not held together by fear alone. It was held together by a carefully cultivated culture of obedience, strategic thinking, and shared understanding of risk and reward. Violence, while an ever-present tool, was applied strategically rather than indiscriminately. Unlike chaotic street gangs which relied on random acts of intimidation, Luciano deployed force to enforce rules, eliminate threats, and maintain order. Every act of violence was calculated, both to achieve tactical objectives and to reinforce the psychological dominance of the organization. This combination of discipline, strategy, and brutality ensured that his operations ran smoothly, profits were maximized, and his reputation remained untouchable. Those who challenged him quickly learned that resistance was not only futile but dangerous. The empire of vice also extended into the realm of social and political influence. Luciano recognized that controlling criminal operations required the tacit cooperation, or at least acquiescence, of law enforcement and public officials. Bribery, strategic alliances, and influence over unions and businesses created a buffer against legal interference. By embedding his empire into the social and economic fabric of the city, Luciano reduced vulnerability and ensured that his operations could continue with minimal disruption. The result was an interlocking system in which crime, politics, and commerce were intertwined, creating both wealth and security. By the early 1930s, Luciano's empire was unparalleled. His operations generated immense wealth, his influence extended across multiple industries, and his organizational structure allowed for resilience in the face of both law enforcement pressure and internal challenges. More than that, he had redefined the very nature of organized crime. It was no longer a chaotic, fragmented collection of gangs and petty thieves, but a disciplined, strategic, and highly profitable enterprise. Through gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, and labor rackets, Luciano had created a network that not only enriched him and his lieutenants but reshaped the underworld itself. In the end, Luciano's empire of vice was a testament to his genius. He combined strategy, psychology, organization, and ruthlessness to create a system that endured far beyond the streets of New York. It was an empire built not only on fear and violence but on efficiency, loyalty, and intelligence. By transforming illegal activity into a disciplined enterprise, he left an indelible mark on organized crime, setting the stage for the modern mafia and cementing his place as one of the most innovative, cunning, and feared figures in American criminal history. As Lucky Luciano's empire expanded, so too did the complexity of his relationships. In the underworld, alliances were as vital as territory, and rivalries as deadly as any weapon. The streets of New York were not just a backdrop, they were a living, breathing organism, where every handshake, every agreement, and every whispered negotiation carried consequences that could reverberate across the city. For Luciano, survival and dominance required navigating this intricate web of friendship and enmity with unerring precision. His rise had been built not only on vision and intelligence but on the cultivation of strategic relationships that could be leveraged for power, profit, and influence. Alliances were carefully crafted. Luciano understood that no man could control the underworld alone, and that mutual benefit was the glue that held partnerships together. He forged bonds with Jewish, Irish, and Italian gangsters, recognizing that shared interests could bridge cultural and territorial divides. These partnerships were transactional but also deeply strategic. By combining resources, controlling multiple markets, and sharing intelligence, Luciano created a network of influence that was far stronger than any individual faction. Trust, however, was always conditional. Loyalty was a currency, earned through demonstrated competence and obedience, and maintained through both incentives and fear. Even among allies, rivalry lurked. The criminal underworld was inherently unstable, and those who appeared to be friends could quickly become competitors. Luciano's genius was in his ability to anticipate these shifts, to read intentions before actions were taken, and to neutralize threats before they became dangerous. He cultivated a duality in his relationships, presenting warmth and camaraderie to those he needed while maintaining an unflinching readiness to act against them if circumstances required. This psychological subtlety ensured that he remained in control, even as personal bonds were tested and alliances strained under the weight of ambition. Betrayal was the ever-present shadow in this world. To Luciano it was not merely a personal affront, it was a structural threat. A single act of disloyalty could destabilize entire operations, incite violence, and invite law enforcement scrutiny. History had shown him the consequences of unchecked treachery. In response, he developed a keen sense of both preemptive and reactive strategy. Those who wavered, disobeyed, or conspired against the organization were dealt with decisively, often in ways that sent clear psychological messages to others. Violence, rumor, and intimidation became instruments of governance, reinforcing the culture of loyalty that underpinned his empire. Among his closest allies, Luciano demonstrated a rare blend of mentorship and strategic manipulation. He nurtured the ambitions of competent subordinates, allowing them to rise and manage portions of his empire, while simultaneously ensuring that their power remained subordinate to his own. Figures such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were not merely lieutenants. They were extensions of Luciano's will, carefully positioned to execute his vision and maintain his dominance across multiple operations. Through these relationships, he created a network that was both loyal and capable, an interconnected web in which each node strengthened the whole. Yet the very relationships that empowered him also created vulnerabilities. Rival mobsters, envious lieutenants, and ambitious outsiders constantly tested the boundaries of loyalty. Luciano's ability to navigate these tensions was as much a psychological feat as a strategic one. He understood human motivations, the lure of wealth, and the fear of death. By leveraging these factors, he maintained control, anticipating betrayal before it occurred and converting potential threats into opportunities when possible. This required constant vigilance, an ability to read both action and intent, and the willingness to act decisively when necessary. The most dangerous rivalries were often internal. Within the Italian-American Mafia, old-school bosses clung to Sicilian traditions and personal vendettas. They viewed Luciano's modernized, systematized approach as a threat to their authority and influence. Negotiations, bribes, and intimidation were frequently employed to bring these figures into alignment, but Luciano was prepared to escalate when diplomacy failed. Assassination, carefully orchestrated acts of violence, and strategic manipulation of public perception became part of his arsenal. In this environment, loyalty was never assumed, it was earned, tested, and continually reaffirmed. Friendship, too, was a complex commodity. Luciano's closest confidants were those who combined personal loyalty with operational competence. However, even among trusted allies, he maintained an edge of detachment. Emotional bonds could cloud judgment, and in the underworld, mistakes were unforgiving. By keeping personal connections at a functional distance, Luciano ensured that decisions were made rationally, strategically, and without compromise to the overarching goals of the organization. In this way, he balanced human relationships with operational efficiency, cultivating trust while remaining insulated from the potential treachery of those around him. The psychological interplay of fear, respect, and reward was central to the maintenance of these relationships. Loyalty was incentivized with wealth, protection, and advancement. Disloyalty was punished with swift and calculated consequences. This duality ensured that associates remained aligned with Luciano's vision, even when personal ambitions or rival influences tempted them to defect. Every interaction, every negotiation, and every decision reinforced the structure of control, embedding obedience and strategic calculation into the culture of the empire. Perhaps the most illustrative moments of this period were the betrayals Luciano had to navigate. Whether it was a lieutenant attempting to seize power, a rival challenging his authority, or a law enforcement informant threatening exposure, each situation tested the integrity of his empire. Luciano's response was always measured but decisive, blending violence, strategy, and psychological manipulation to neutralize threats while maintaining the cohesion of his network. These episodes reinforced both his reputation and the organizational principles he had established. Loyalty, fear, and strategic intelligence were non-negotiable. Through these dynamics, Luciano demonstrated that leadership in the underworld was as much a psychological art as a demonstration of force. The empire he built required constant management of human ambition, risk, and emotion. Alliances and rivalries were not incidental. They were the terrain upon which he navigated power, maintained stability, and expanded influence. In mastering this complex web, Luciano became more than a mobster. He became a strategist, a psychologist, and a visionary capable of orchestrating both human behavior and criminal enterprise with unparalleled precision. Ultimately, the world of friends, foes, and fatal betrayals defined the very essence of Luciano's leadership. Power in the underworld was never static. It was fluid, contingent on relationships, perception, and the constant interplay of loyalty and fear. Luciano thrived in this environment because he understood the rules better than anyone, calculated the risks with precision, and acted decisively when threats emerged. Through careful alliances, calculated rivalries, and ruthless enforcement of loyalty, he maintained control over an empire that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of ambition, treachery, and chaos. In the end, the psychological complexity of these relationships was as crucial to his power as any act of violence or business maneuver. Friends could be leveraged, foes neutralized, and betrayal transformed into strategic advantage. This mastery over human behavior, combined with his organizational genius, allowed Luciano to dominate the underworld not merely through fear, but through a sophisticated system of influence, incentive, and control. The streets of New York spoke his name because he had learned to manipulate the most dangerous game of all: the human heart, ambition, and loyalty in a world where both could shift with lethal speed. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire was flourishing, but success in the underworld was never without peril. Expansion and power inevitably drew attention, from rival gangs, disgruntled former allies, and, most dangerously, law enforcement. The streets of New York were a theater of hidden war, where violence was only one layer of a complex struggle for control, influence, and survival. Luciano's genius lay not only in building an empire but in navigating this invisible battlefield, balancing offense, defense, and diplomacy to maintain dominance while avoiding the pitfalls that had destroyed so many ambitious gangsters before him. The most immediate threat came from rival factions within the Mafia itself. Traditional Sicilian bosses, resistant to Luciano's modern, business-minded approach, viewed his rise with suspicion and hostility. Violence, intimidation, and strategic betrayal were constant risks. Luciano had to maintain control over his own lieutenants while simultaneously neutralizing external threats. This required precision, patience, and psychological insight. Each confrontation was a game of chess, with moves carefully calculated to maximize gain and minimize exposure. Guerrilla tactics, assassinations, and strategic alliances became his tools of war, creating an environment in which survival depended as much on intelligence and foresight as on brute force. At the same time, the pressure from law enforcement was mounting. Prohibition had brought unprecedented wealth to organized crime, but it also made criminal activity more visible and politically sensitive. Police forces, the district attorney's office, and federal agents were all keenly aware of the scale and organization of Luciano's operations. Investigations were launched, raids conducted, and surveillance intensified. Luciano understood that conventional street smarts were no longer enough. To survive, he needed systems, protocols, and psychological strategies that could insulate the organization from exposure while allowing it to operate efficiently. One of Luciano's most remarkable survival tactics was compartmentalization. He created layers of intermediaries, ensuring that critical knowledge and operational secrets were never concentrated in one individual. Lieutenants managed day-to-day operations, reporting selectively to him, while lower-level associates were kept focused on specific tasks without understanding the larger organizational structure. This minimized risk. Even if a lower-level operative was arrested or turned informant, the integrity of the broader empire remained intact. The architecture of secrecy became both a shield and a weapon, allowing Luciano to operate under constant scrutiny while maintaining centralized control. Psychologically, Luciano understood the interplay of fear, respect, and influence in managing both his network and the external world. Law enforcement was unpredictable, and public perception could be manipulated to his advantage. Bribes, strategic intelligence, and selective cooperation allowed him to influence key officials, ensuring that raids and arrests rarely disrupted critical operations. At the same time, he used public persona and calculated intimidation to reinforce his reputation, sending a message that resistance, whether from law enforcement or rival gangs, carried consequences. In this way, Luciano controlled the battlefield not only through direct action but through perception, projecting power that extended far beyond his immediate reach. The hidden war was also fought through diplomacy and strategic alliances. Luciano recognized that not all conflicts required violence. Some could be resolved through negotiation, mutual interest, or shared risk. By forging temporary truces with rivals, collaborating with other criminal factions, and mediating disputes, he reduced unnecessary conflict and strengthened the stability of his empire. This pragmatic approach was revolutionary. It transformed organized crime from a chaotic, violence-driven network into a disciplined, resilient system capable of long-term sustainability. Luciano's understanding of psychology allowed him to see both threat and opportunity in every interaction, turning potential enemies into tools and conflicts into strategic advantages. One of the defining aspects of this hidden war was the constant negotiation with risk. Every shipment of bootleg alcohol, every gambling den, every labor racket was a potential exposure. Yet Luciano's meticulous organization, combined with his psychological acuity, allowed him to anticipate law enforcement actions, minimize leaks, and ensure operational continuity. Surveillance, informants, and careful planning allowed the empire to thrive even under intense scrutiny. The combination of intelligence, preparation, and ruthlessness ensured that threats could be neutralized before they escalated into existential crises. Violence remained a critical element, but it was applied strategically. Unlike chaotic street gangs, which often relied on spontaneous acts of intimidation, Luciano used targeted violence to maintain order, enforce loyalty, and eliminate threats. Murders, disappearances, and beatings were not random. They were calculated messages designed to reinforce discipline, demonstrate power, and manipulate perception. Each act of force was carefully timed and executed, balancing the immediate tactical objective with broader psychological and operational consequences. In this way, violence became a tool of both offense and defense, tightly integrated into the strategic management of his empire. The hidden war also extended to the manipulation of public perception. Luciano understood that reputation was a weapon, and that fear could be amplified through rumor, selective leaks, and the spectacle of calculated retribution. Stories of his ruthlessness and cunning circulated through the streets, creating a psychological landscape in which rivals hesitated, subordinates obeyed, and law enforcement approached with caution. The perception of invincibility was as valuable as actual power. It deterred challenges, reinforced loyalty, and allowed the empire to operate with a margin of psychological advantage that few rivals could match. Despite the constant pressures, Luciano's ability to navigate the hidden war demonstrated his exceptional strategic intelligence. He balanced risk and reward, loyalty and fear, diplomacy and violence, all while expanding his empire and consolidating his influence. The streets were a battlefield, law enforcement a persistent threat, and rivals ever-present dangers. But Luciano's foresight, organization, and psychological mastery allowed him to maintain control where others would have faltered. Every move was calculated, every action measured, and every consequence anticipated, creating an environment in which survival and dominance were intertwined. Ultimately, the hidden war was the crucible in which Luciano's genius was fully realized. His ability to balance human psychology, organizational efficiency, and strategic foresight allowed him to thrive in an environment defined by constant risk, betrayal, and pressure. The underworld of New York was a volatile and dangerous place, but through compartmentalization, strategic alliances, calculated violence, and psychological insight, Luciano maintained not only survival but supremacy. In doing so, he set the standard for modern organized crime, demonstrating that true power is not merely about wealth or brutality, it is about mastery of complexity, influence, and perception. Even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable to cracks, and for lucky Luciano, the seeds of his downfall were already taking root by the mid-1930s. The very brilliance that had allowed him to dominate the underworld, the centralization of power, the calculated alliances, the disciplined control over vice, also made him a target for law enforcement, rival factions, and ambitious subordinates. The hidden war that had defined his reign could no longer be waged entirely in the shadows. Pressure was mounting from all directions, and the first signs of Luciano's empire beginning to fracture appeared not with a grand battle but through a series of legal, social, and personal challenges that would eventually culminate in his arrest. The turning point was a combination of intense law enforcement scrutiny and the betrayal of those closest to him. Prohibition-era enforcement had evolved, with federal authorities deploying more sophisticated investigative methods, wiretaps, and informants. Luciano's operations, once insulated by compartmentalization and psychological control, were now being penetrated. The vast networks of associates he had cultivated over decades, while loyal, also included opportunists and ambitious figures willing to trade information for leniency. Each leak, each testimony, chipped away at the fortress he had built, revealing that even genius could not completely shield itself from the relentless pressures of justice. The arrest that signaled the beginning of the end was precipitated by charges of compulsory prostitution. While Luciano had long controlled sex work as part of his empire, his system had relied on secrecy, management, and calculated discretion. Yet the combination of ambitious law enforcement officials, aggressive prosecution, and informants willing to testify began to expose the extent of his control. For the first time, the carefully orchestrated public image of invincibility was challenged. News reports painted him as the kingpin of corruption, a criminal mastermind whose reach extended into the very fabric of New York society. The myth, once protective, now became a liability, attracting scrutiny that could not be easily mitigated. Betrayal played a pivotal role in this unraveling. Associates who had once been loyal saw opportunity in cooperating with authorities, reducing their sentences in exchange for testimony. Even trusted lieutenants were not immune to pressure or fear. Luciano, who had built his empire on calculated psychology and loyalty, now faced the stark reality that fear, when coupled with legal leverage, could dissolve even the most carefully maintained bonds. The lessons he had imparted, the culture he had cultivated, and the systems he had designed were suddenly vulnerable to the human frailty he had long managed to control. Psychologically, the fall was as significant as the legal implications. For a man whose life had been defined by control, organization, and strategic dominance, the realization that he could be cornered, manipulated, and brought low was a profound shock. It was a turning point in the narrative of his empire. The streets, once entirely under his command, now seemed uncertain. Allies, once dependable, now revealed their conditional loyalty, and the law, once distant, now pressed relentlessly at the gates of his power. This shift demanded rapid adaptation, but even Luciano's considerable intelligence could not entirely mitigate the forces aligned against him. The trial itself became a theater of tension, spectacle, and psychological warfare. Prosecutors sought to portray him as the orchestrator of an entire criminal network, a man whose vision and ruthlessness had corrupted both the underworld and the wider city. Witnesses, some coerced, some motivated by self-interest, testified to his operations, his influence, and the inner workings of his empire. Luciano's legal team fought to contain the damage, but the sheer scale of the charges, combined with the weight of testimony from former allies, created an overwhelming narrative of guilt. The courtroom became a stage not only for legal proceedings but for the dramatic unraveling of a myth, exposing the human vulnerabilities behind the legend of Lucky Luciano. The personal dimension of the fall was equally striking. For a man who had mastered influence, fear, and loyalty, the realization that betrayal could come from within his inner circle was deeply destabilizing. Friends became witnesses, confidants became liabilities, and the very structures he had relied upon to maintain control were being repurposed against him. The psychological toll was immense. Yet even in this vulnerability, Luciano displayed the cold calculation that had defined his rise. He assessed threats, negotiated where possible, and attempted to maintain influence over his empire, even as the foundations beneath him trembled. Luciano's arrest marked not just a legal defeat but a symbolic shift in the underworld. The empire he had painstakingly constructed was now exposed to the twin forces of legal prosecution and internal instability. Competitors watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. Lieutenants faced difficult choices between loyalty and self-preservation, and the law signaled that the era of unchecked dominance might finally be ending. For the first time, the balance of power was no longer in his hands alone, and every move required careful calculation to mitigate the damage and preserve what could be salvaged. Yet even as the fall began, Luciano's genius was evident in how he responded. He leveraged remaining allies, manipulated perception, and attempted to contain the crisis through strategy and negotiation. His understanding of psychology, loyalty, and fear allowed him to navigate the early stages of collapse with remarkable resilience. While the arrest was a dramatic blow, it did not immediately destroy the empire he had built. Rather, it signaled the start of a new phase, one in which survival would require adaptation, patience, and a recalibration of both strategy and ambition. The beginning of Luciano's fall also underscored the paradox of his power. The very systems, alliances, and psychological frameworks that had elevated him to legendary status were now vulnerable to exploitation. Loyalty could be bought, fear could be leveraged by legal authorities, and strategic complexity could be penetrated with sufficient pressure and information. The fall was not the result of a single misstep, but the accumulation of pressures that even a genius could not entirely anticipate. It was a moment of vulnerability that revealed the human fragility behind the myth of invincibility. Ultimately, the fall of Luciano began with the arrest, but it was a complex interplay of betrayal, legal pressure, and psychological exposure. The empire he had built, while formidable, was suddenly under threat from forces that could not be subdued by muscle, strategy, or reputation alone. This moment marked the end of one era, the age of unchallenged dominance, and the beginning of another in which the genius of Luciano would be tested not by expansion or control, but by his ability to survive, adapt, and influence events from a position of vulnerability. The fall had begun, but the story was far from over. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle that gripped New York and captivated a nation. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's name had become synonymous with organized crime, vice, and corruption. Newspapers splashed his image across front pages, portraying him as the mastermind behind an empire that had infiltrated the city's streets, docks, gambling dens, and even labor unions. Public fascination was fueled by the contrast between his polished demeanor and the ruthless violence of his operations. The trial was not merely about establishing guilt, it was about shaping the narrative of power, morality, and criminal genius in America. From the opening statements, it was clear that the prosecution sought to dismantle not only Luciano's operations but the myth he had cultivated. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man whose brilliance had been matched only by his audacity, a criminal strategist who had orchestrated prostitution rings, controlled bootlegging networks, and manipulated unions for profit. Witnesses, former associates, coerced participants, and law enforcement informants testified in meticulous detail, revealing the inner workings of an empire that had once seemed untouchable. The courtroom became a theater of revelation, exposing the scale, organization, and psychological depth of Luciano's operations to a public eager for both scandal and understanding. Psychologically, the trial represented a profound test for Luciano. A man accustomed to controlling narratives, shaping perception, and manipulating human behavior now faced a stage where the forces of law, media, and former allies converged against him. The tension in the courtroom mirrored the hidden wars of the streets. Every glance, every word, every strategic pause carried weight. Luciano understood the stakes. Conviction meant not only personal punishment but the destabilization of an empire he had spent decades constructing. Yet, despite the pressure, he maintained the composure that had defined his leadership, presenting himself with an air of calculated confidence that reinforced both fear and admiration among observers. Defense strategies focused on minimizing exposure while challenging the credibility of witnesses. Luciano's attorneys highlighted inconsistencies in testimonies, questioned motivations, and sought to frame allegations as exaggerated or opportunistic. Yet the sheer weight of evidence, combined with public and political pressure, made the courtroom a treacherous environment. Each cross-examination, each revelation of operational detail, chipped away at the carefully constructed narrative of invincibility. Luciano, who had long controlled his environment, now had to navigate a situation in which perception, interpretation, and legal technicalities would determine his fate. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception. Journalists, eager for sensational stories, portrayed Luciano in extremes, both as a calculating genius and as a symbol of moral decay. Headlines, photographs, and editorials amplified the stakes of the trial, transforming it into a cultural event as much as a legal one. This attention intensified the pressure on the courtroom, influencing jurors and embedding the trial within the broader societal consciousness. Luciano's empire, built in shadows, was now illuminated under the relentless scrutiny of the press, forcing both his defenders and adversaries to contend with the power of public opinion. Underlying the trial was a deeper moral narrative. Prosecutors framed Luciano not merely as a criminal but as a corrupter of society, a man whose ambitions had subverted law, morality, and public order. This narrative resonated with a public struggling with the social upheavals of the Depression era, the lingering effects of Prohibition, and widespread concern over corruption. The courtroom thus became a stage for competing visions of justice, morality, and power, one of pragmatic criminal genius, the other of societal accountability and ethical order. For Luciano, this was a battle not only for freedom but for the preservation of his legacy, reputation, and the structural integrity of his empire. The sentencing phase crystallized the consequences of this complex interplay. The judge, constrained by law but influenced by public sentiment and the dramatic evidence presented, imposed a sentence that was both severe and symbolic. Luciano was convicted of compulsory prostitution, a charge that carried a lengthy prison term. The sentence was a stark reminder that even the most brilliant and disciplined systems of power were vulnerable to external forces, law, morality, and betrayal. The empire he had built, while resilient, had revealed cracks that no strategic genius could fully conceal. Yet even in the sentencing, Luciano's strategic mind remained at work. He understood that a prison term, while punitive, was not the end of influence. The systems he had established, the loyalty he had cultivated, and the structures he had implemented allowed him to maintain control of operations from behind bars. The empire was not destroyed by the sentence, it had merely shifted its dynamics. Luciano's ability to adapt to this new reality, to exert authority despite confinement, demonstrated a resilience and foresight that elevated him beyond the role of a conventional criminal. Psychologically, the trial and sentence were transformative. They exposed the vulnerabilities of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the limits of control in a world influenced by law, perception, and betrayal. Yet they also underscored Luciano's mastery of strategy, both human and organizational. He faced one of the most formidable challenges of his life and responded with the same calculated intelligence that had defined his rise, measuring risk, managing perception, and ensuring that the structures he had built could withstand even direct legal assault. The trial also highlighted the paradox of Luciano's genius. His rise had depended on the careful orchestration of secrecy, loyalty, and psychological manipulation. Yet, in the courtroom these tools could only go so far. Human witnesses, legal precedent, and public scrutiny were forces beyond the reach of even his most meticulous planning. The trial was, in essence, a collision between the controlled world of the underworld and the unpredictable realities of law and society. It revealed that mastery of one domain does not guarantee invulnerability in another, and that even the most disciplined empires have fault lines exposed by human systems of accountability. Ultimately, the trial and sentencing marked a defining moment in Luciano's life and in the history of organized crime. It was a public reckoning, a psychological test, and a narrative pivot. The myth of invincibility had been challenged, yet the genius of organization, strategy, and influence remained evident. Luciano's empire was no longer untouchable, but it was resilient. His authority, while challenged, remained structured through loyalty, fear, and systemic discipline. The courtroom had not destroyed him. It had redefined the landscape in which he would continue to operate, demonstrating that even in apparent defeat, power can endure, adapt, and reassert itself. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's power was far from diminished. For a man whose genius lay in organization, psychology, and strategic foresight, prison was not an endpoint but a new battlefield. Confinement could restrict his movements, but it could not contain his mind. From the moment he entered the facility, Luciano assessed the environment. Inmates, guards, intermediaries, and even visitors became elements in a complex social and operational network. He quickly identified leverage points, recognizing that influence could be exercised subtly, strategically, and indirectly. Luciano applied the same principles that had guided him on the streets. Loyalty and fear were central, but so was perception. His reputation preceded him, instilling respect and caution in both prisoners and staff. He understood that authority is as much psychological as physical, and he projected an aura of control that reinforced his position. Even acts of intimidation or selective enforcement of power were calculated to demonstrate influence without drawing unnecessary attention or legal scrutiny. Communication remained a cornerstone of his empire. Trusted lieutenants, lawyers, and visitors acted as conduits, allowing Luciano to oversee operations, issue instructions, and receive intelligence from the outside world. Compartmentalization, the system he had perfected on the streets, was crucial. Operatives managed day-to-day tasks independently, reporting selectively, ensuring that no single breach could expose the larger network. This allowed the empire to continue functioning efficiently despite the absence of its leader. Inside the prison, Luciano also observed and manipulated social dynamics. Alliances among inmates and power struggles among guards and administrators became opportunities to consolidate influence. He cultivated relationships where possible, exploited rivalries when advantageous, and maintained psychological dominance over those around him. Every interaction was a calculated maneuver in a confined, high-stakes environment. Violence, though less frequent than on the streets, remained a strategic tool. Targeted acts reinforced loyalty, deterred challenges, and maintained respect for authority. Luciano's approach was never chaotic. It was methodical, aligning with his philosophy that power must be exercised with precision. Even the threat of action could achieve compliance, demonstrating that leadership could extend beyond direct intervention. Psychologically, the prison environment tested resilience. Isolation, restriction, and constant surveillance could have undermined a lesser leader. Luciano reframed these limitations as opportunities. Time in confinement allowed for observation, reflection, and strategic planning. He refined alliances, considered long-term objectives, and evaluated the operational integrity of his empire. The prison became a vantage point from which he could assess threats, anticipate challenges, and reinforce his authority. Externally, Luciano's influence remained formidable. Associates and lieutenants understood that his incarceration did not signal weakness. His directives were respected, his counsel sought, and his reputation continued to command both fear and loyalty. Even in absentia, he remained the central node of the criminal network, demonstrating that true power is embedded not in presence alone but in the systems, relationships, and psychological structures one builds. Luciano also leveraged legal and administrative pressure strategically. By cultivating relationships with lawyers, political contacts, and sympathetic intermediaries, he mitigated threats and positioned himself for future opportunities. He understood the interplay between law, perception, and influence, ensuring that even prison could be navigated advantageously. Ultimately, Luciano's time behind bars underscored the durability of his genius. He transformed confinement from a limitation into a domain for strategic oversight. His ability to maintain control, influence behavior, and safeguard his empire demonstrated a mastery of organizational design and psychological manipulation unmatched in the criminal underworld. Power, he proved, is not dependent on proximity but on strategy, perception, and foresight. Even within the confines of prison, Luciano remained a master tactician. He balanced risk with opportunity, loyalty with fear, and strategy with patience. The empire he had built continued to operate, his influence extended beyond walls, and his legend grew. Confinement tested his limits, but it could not diminish the systems, discipline, and intellect that defined his leadership. Luciano's experience behind bars became a defining chapter in his life. It revealed the resilience of his empire, the loyalty of his associates, and his capacity to adapt to extreme circumstances. Prison was a crucible, testing not only his organizational acumen but also his psychological fortitude. By maintaining command, projecting authority, and shaping outcomes from within confinement, Luciano demonstrated that true power endures beyond the immediate reach of control, transcending walls, borders, and circumstance. Even in this restricted environment, Luciano's genius shone. He remained not just a criminal but a strategist, a visionary, and an architect of influence, proving that an empire built on loyalty, fear, and strategic insight could withstand even the most formidable constraints. His power behind bars was a testament to the enduring reach of intellect and psychological mastery, a defining illustration of how genius can operate, influence, and endure, even when the streets themselves are no longer accessible. When Lucky Luciano was released from prison, the streets of New York were no longer his to command. In 1946 he was deported to Italy, a dramatic reversal for the man who had dominated the American underworld. Italy, scarred by war and political upheaval, was a world both alien and familiar. Yet exile did not diminish Luciano's strategic mind. From the margins he maintained contact with allies in the U.S., coordinated operations, and positioned himself to influence emerging European criminal networks. Exile forced adaptation. He leveraged reputation, psychological insight, and negotiation to navigate a new terrain where direct power was limited. His understanding of loyalty, fear, and ambition allowed him to project authority despite physical displacement. The man who once orchestrated New York's criminal empire was now a strategist operating from afar, observing shifts in alliances, managing influence, and preparing for opportunities long into the future. Psychologically, exile offered reflection. Removed from immediate threats, Luciano considered the human and structural dimensions of power, how loyalty could be manipulated, ambition contained, and empires preserved. He became both a criminal tactician and a thinker, recognizing that true power transcends proximity and relies on foresight, influence, and adaptability. Even in displacement, Luciano remained a figure of consequence, proving that strategic genius cannot be confined by walls, borders, or circumstance. Exile was not an end but a transformation, a stage in which the mind of the master continued to shape the world around him. Lucky Luciano's life is a study in power, psychology, and human ambition. He did not simply run a criminal empire, he transformed the underworld into a disciplined, structured organization. Through the creation of the Commission, the codification of omerta, and the professionalization of vice, he institutionalized power in ways that endured long after his death. His genius lay in understanding not only strategy but human behavior. Loyalty, fear, respect, and ambition were tools he wielded as effectively as money or muscle. Yet his legacy is a paradox. The brilliance that enabled his rise also exposed vulnerabilities. Betrayal, legal pressure, and exile demonstrated the limits of control, highlighting the fragility of even the most meticulously organized empire. Luciano's life shows that influence, while enduring, is never absolute. It depends on perception, psychology, and adaptability. Culturally, Luciano became a legend, a figure immortalized in media, myth, and historical narrative. But behind the myth was a man of extraordinary intellect, shaped by circumstance, ambition, and environment. His life illustrates the balance of strategy, morality, and human psychology, offering lessons that extend beyond crime, leadership, organizational design, and the navigation of risk and loyalty. Ultimately, Luciano's story is a journey of contrasts: power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, myth and reality. He reshaped organized crime and left a psychological and structural legacy that persists globally. The streets once whispered his name, but history remembers him as more than a mobster, a strategist, a visionary, and a master of influence, whose story illuminates the enduring complexity of human ambition and the art of power.